Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Lee. I work for the Solano County Water Agency and also represent the Solano Groundwater Sustainability Agency. We want to welcome everyone on behalf of the 5 GSAs who have developed the Solano Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan, and we really do appreciate you for attending tonight. We are recording the meeting tonight to put on our website to share with those that could not attend tonight. We will be diving into the meeting content here shortly. I did want to mention that this is an outreach meeting tonight. This is not the public hearing for the Prop 218 charge. That will occur on July 14th. In a moment, I'm going to be passing it off to Raina, who's going to be talking about our interpretation services tonight, and then Jen Fox from Ag Innovations, who's going to introduce what we plan to cover tonight. So at this point, Raina, I'm going to pass it to you and the next slide.
Thank you, Chris. Muy buenas noches a todos. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to give some brief instructions on how our Spanish-speaking community members can join interpretation, since we will be providing simultaneous interpretation throughout the meeting. Para los que están aquí unidos el día de hoy, que les gustaría escuchar esta reunión en español, tenemos interpretación simultánea disponible. En este momento ya se ha encendido el modo de interpretación y nuestra colega Tania ya va a estar esperándolos en el modo de interpretación para que ustedes se puedan unir. En un momento va a poder ver un icono en su pantalla que parece un mundo. Cuando usted mire el icono que parece un mundo, si usted está usando una computadora, usted va a seleccionar su lenguaje de preferencia. En este caso va a ser español. Y justo abajo del español está una opción para poner el audio original en silencio. Le invito a poner el audio original en silencio para que de esta manera solamente escuche su lenguaje de preferencia. Si usted está unido a nosotros por medio de un diapositivo como un celular, una tableta, sus opciones van a ser diferentes. Usted va a querer seleccionar los 3 puntitos que están en la parte inferior de su pantalla a mano derecha. Después de que seleccionan los 3 puntitos, va a tener que deslizar un poquito hacia arriba y va a seleccionar el lenguaje. Me selecciona español y por último, una vez más, poner el audio original en silencio. Y esto le permitirá participar en su totalidad y no olvide poner listo o finalizado después de seleccionar su lenguaje. Usted puede someter cualquier pregunta, comentario que usted tenga por medio de la función de chat que está abajo de la pantalla y nosotros estaremos aquí para asistir y asegurar que usted esté participando. For all of our presenters, just a quick reminder, this is simultaneous interpretation, which means real time, but we are definitely not machine operated. So we just welcome you to take your time and pace yourself to ensure that we can facilitate language interpretation at the best of our ability. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Raina and Chris. And yeah, thanks to all of you who have joined. I'm going to be, again, speaking slowly, but I also want to take us through a lot tonight. So if we can go to the next slide. Again, my name is Jen Fox, and I'm facilitating this evening. I'm with Ag Innovations, a nonprofit that's leading community engagement for the Subbasin. And Judy, if you wouldn't mind just going to the next slide, it emphasizes that we're here because your voice is essential. So my main role this evening is to make sure that your questions get answered and that we share information, we hear your questions, and we end on time. So that's what I'm here to do, and we really appreciate all of you joining tonight. If we can go to the next slide, I want to share on the next slide 2 notes about our platform this evening. As mentioned, but for those of you who joined late, this meeting is being recorded and it will be available on the solanogsp.com website. So for any colleagues who missed it, we will be posting the recording there. This slide also shows the chat feature. I want to mention that we're going to use the chat in a minute for introductions, but then following that, we're going to change the chat to one-on-one only so that you can use the question answer function so we can clearly record everyone's questions. But first, we want to hear more about you and why you're here. So if you can go to the next slide, Judy, I'm going to invite everybody to please type in the chat. There's instructions in English and in Espanol. And I'm going to invite you to share your name, where in the Solano Subbasin you live, work, or farm, and what brings you here tonight. So if you can please go ahead and enter that information to the chat, it will allow everybody on this call. We have 82 participants right now. Please go ahead and share those things in the chat. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Great. Appreciate a few folks entering who you are. Please also note where in the subbasin you live, work, or farm, and what brings you here tonight. So I see we have folks from Solano Irrigation District, someone from Benicia. Thanks, Rich. We have a farmer near Putah Creek. It's great to see that we have someone from Eaton Drilling. Again, some folks from Solano Irrigation District, different groundwater professionals, folks in Vacaville, Rio Vista, English Hills. Great. Please feel free to take a few more minutes and introduce yourself. I love it. Folks are noting, some people are discovering just what this is about, and some people have probably participated in a lot of virtual town halls. And in a minute, we're going to take a little bit of a poll. So stay at your computer, and we'll be taking a poll so we can hear a little more about your level of knowledge. So thanks, and please feel free to introduce yourself if you haven't. See our orchards on the phone. Great to see folks from all around the subbasin. Right now, I'm seeing 86 folks on the call, and we will be continuing to share information as we go. But while you continue to introduce yourself, I'm going to invite Judy to take us to the next slide, which includes just some overall objectives for this evening. We've got a lot to cover tonight, but we also have we really have allocated most of the time to hearing your questions. We do want to start by sharing some context and then talk about how costs were determined, and focus in on proposed charges within the Solano GSA. And we're going to have time for a lot of question and answer. Noting that most of you are here to discuss charges, I also want to note that in our May 3rd town hall, which is, we'll put a link in the chat to everybody where that is, but we talked in depth about the groundwater sustainability plan process, and we'll include a link to that recording in the chat. And I just want to mention, I noticed a few of you introduced yourself and just said, hey, I want to learn what's going on. I just want to highlight for you, this is one in a series of virtual town halls that we've had. And we're not going to go through all the background, but do feel free to check out that link in the chat. You can see earlier slides where we talked about a lot of the basic information. Tonight, we definitely, as I mentioned, Judy, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Tonight, we want to make sure that we leave a lot of time for question and answer. So we will be providing some context. And in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to invite us to learn more about GSP implementation and the calculation of costs for the Solano Subbasin. But first, we want to hear about what interests you. So if we can go to the next slide, Lupe, I'm going to ask you to launch question 1 in the poll. So everybody's going to have an opportunity using the Zoom platform. You just click on the answer to how many town halls have you been? A lot. I'm already seeing some folks jumping in. Wow, about 2/3 of the folks, it's your first one. No, and as we're changing right now, about half of you have attended 2 or more. I'm going to give folks 1 more minute or 10 more seconds to just tell us how many town halls have you attended. Great. I'm seeing 50 people have replied. So Lupe, do you mind just sharing that? Yeah, and so folks will be able to see what you're looking at here with the sharing of question 1 is about, half and half and some in between. So just recognize, for those of you who have attended more than 2 of these, we're going to have a little repeated information. And we also want to honor those of you who it's your first town hall. We really appreciate all of you coming. In a minute, I'm going to describe how to do question and answer, and we invite you to ask any question, whether it's your first one or whether you have detailed questions. That's what tonight is for. Lupe, would you mind going to the next question? Great. So this next question asks how you heard about the event. So we know that people have heard lots of different ways. We always work very hard to get the word out, this meeting especially. So just want to hear how you heard. A bunch of folks heard word of mouth. It looks like more than half of you right now are on the Solano GSP newsletter. So we're excited that we're getting the word out that way. And then a few folks who heard by newspaper or social media. Good. So Lupe, if you don't mind ending this poll and sharing the results. You can see that people heard in a variety of different ways. And why don't we go to the last question, which is about whether or not you commented on the groundwater sustainability plan. So for the past number of years, as Chris described, or will describe a little bit more, there's been work, the state has required groundwater sustainability planning, and it's been a multi-year process that so many people in the subbasin has worked on. I want to thank, there was a community advisory committee who gave great input. There were irrigation districts, as you saw in attendance, who did so much work, and it's great to see. I'm noticing, I'll give folks 10 more seconds to complete the poll, but I'm noticing about a quarter of you have read and even commented on the plan, a quarter of you have read parts, but it looks like a good third of you have not seen the plan but have heard of it. So Lupe, if you don't mind, go ahead and share the results of this poll. I think this helps both people in attendance and those of us speaking to recognize that, a lot of folks, again, in the room have been very involved. Thank you. And for some folks, this is a little bit new. And even for 13% of the folks might not know some of the work that went in. So thanks, everybody. We really appreciate the chance to get to know a little bit more about you. And that will help, just in the question and answer, will help everybody to realize that we have all levels of familiarity coming into the work. So one last thing, if you haven't yet seen the plan, please check it out. We'll go ahead and put the link into the chat. So want to just pause for a minute and say thank you again for being here, especially to those of you who I know that there's some people, it's your first town hall, and those of you who have come to many. We appreciate all of you being here. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Chris Lee of the Solano Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and also SQUA, the water agency, to talk about the sustainable groundwater management and the Solano Subbasin. So Chris, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jen. And as Jen said, we're going to just give you some brief background for a couple of you. Obviously, this is your first time attending one of these virtual town halls. Some of you, this is your second or third time. So really just give you some context of why we're doing the charge, why it's required. And so if we can go to the next slide, Judy. So as Jen mentioned, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was signed by the governor in the fall of 2014, became effective January 1st of 2015. And it's where the state actually required medium and high priority subbasins to develop groundwater sustainability plans, or GSPs. Since our Solano Subbasin is a medium priority subbasin, we were required to develop a groundwater sustainability plan. We're also required to maintain a functional GSA, or a groundwater sustainability agency, or in our case, we actually have multiple GSAs, and I'll talk about that here shortly, that are going to manage the groundwater sustainability plan. We also have to provide continuous outreach and coordination at meetings such as this. We have to monitor our groundwater, put together annual reports to the state. And then every 5 years, we actually have to do a much larger update to the state that requires actually quite a bit of work. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later as we talk about the charge and what those charges are going to pay for. And these activities that I just mentioned are going to be a large part of that. So what we are proposing right now is a flat charge of $2.79 per acre. And we know that this is not something that any of you want. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but even our Solano GSA board, they've struggled with this. You know, it's a really difficult thing that we have to do, but there's a really good reason of why we're doing this. And we'll talk about that here shortly. But essentially we want to maintain local control and make sure that the state water board doesn't come into Solano County and really start telling us what to do. So that's really the main reason, to make sure we are complying with the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and maintaining local control. We're very fortunate that our sub-basin is in pretty good shape. We're one of the few ones actually statewide, and a lot of that has to do with our great water supply at Lake Berryessa. Next slide, please. So this map does show the Solano Subbasin and the different GSAs, or groundwater sustainability agencies, that have been working together for the last 5+ years now on the groundwater sustainability plan. The Solano GSA, which I represent, and we have several board members, I really want to welcome them that have joined us tonight. We're the largest of the GSAs, as you can see on the map, and our GSA actually uses most of the groundwater. About 86% of the groundwater in the subbasin is used by the Solano GSA. If you're not quite sure which GSA you belong to, we've got a fantastic tool up on our website, an interactive map where essentially you can type in your address and it will tell you which of the GSAs you are a part of. And so tonight, really, we're going to be focusing on the Solano GSA for long-term funding. As will be mentioned later, all of the other GSAs have existing funding mechanisms in place. We do not, and that's why we're doing this charge, again, to comply with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act from the state, as well as the GSP itself. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the state is requiring us to do this plan. We have a lot of activities that are required beyond the annual reports that are needed to be submitted by April 1st of each year. We have to do comprehensive updates every 5 years. We have to monitor groundwater levels, look at water quality and other constituents of concern throughout the subbasin. We're going to continue with efforts like tonight with education and outreach in different types of venues. We're going to be looking in the future to secure any grants to help potentially offset some of these costs. And in the near future, we're actually going to be seeing if there are some landowners who might want to participate in some pilot projects, like capturing rainwater or additional floodwaters to recharge the subbasin. So we're going to be getting into details in the charge here in a moment that are required by the GSP actions. But first, I wanted to just kind of show you a long-range schedule. As mentioned earlier, we had several GSAs formed back in June of 2017. We submitted the groundwater sustainability plan to the Department of Water Resources at the end of January of this year. And now we actually have 20 years to show the state that we are managing our groundwater resources in a sustainable manner, which honestly, I think we can say we're well on our way of doing, if in fact we're not already managing those resources in a sustainable manner, which is a really good reason of why we need to maintain local control. Things are actually pretty good here. We've got a robust agriculture community. We want to make sure the state doesn't come in and start dictating what they want to charge, asking people to put meters on their wells, telling them how much groundwater they can pump. We want to stay away from that altogether. So that's why we need to maintain local control. Next slide, please. So these are the 5 GSAs that were mentioned earlier. We've been calling ourselves the Solano Collaborative. We've been working together for multiple years now, working very closely and with our consultant teams to develop the groundwater sustainability plan, along with the Solano GSA, which I represent as their staff. We have the City of Vacaville GSA, Sacramento County GSA, the Solano Irrigation District GSA, and the Northern Delta GSA. And then we've also got several independent reclamation districts out in the Delta that kind of formed right at the last minute and have not really participated in developing the GSP, but we did want to recognize them as GSAs, and we're going to continue to try to coordinate with those groups as well. And so what we're going to discuss now is how the state required implementation activities, how much they'll cost, and again, essentially why we're doing the charge to pay for those activities. All right, thanks, Jen. Why don't we go to the next slide? We'll see what we have there.
Yeah.
Okay, so a large part of why we are doing the Proposition 218 charge is really to make sure that the subbasin as a whole is in compliance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. As I just mentioned, the other GSAs that have been working with us and participating in this process over the last 5+ years, they have existing funding mechanisms in place. And so they're going to be essentially contributing their part for implementation activities directly to the Solano GSA, whereas the Solano GSA actually has to start this new funding mechanism, which is the Prop 218 process. And again, all the GSAs within the subbasin must comply with SGMA. We all must contribute towards the implementation actions that are required through SGMA, which we have to report to the state through our annual reports. And then, as I mentioned earlier, much more comprehensive 5-year annual updates. All right, Jen, why don't we go to the next slide? Okay, so essentially what we are looking at, and this is something that we have followed statewide. Again, this is not something unique to the Solano Subbasin or Solano County. Every county in the state is looking at some type of funding mechanism to pay for their groundwater sustainability plans and their compliance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So essentially what this slide is showing is that for each of the GSAs, they are paying their own administrative costs. So for any type of overhead or staff time. One thing I did want to point out is that for the Solano GSA, we have tried to keep our overhead, our administrative costs as low as possible. The Solano GSA actually doesn't pay for any staff time or doesn't pay for a building or any administrative overhead. That's actually all contributed through the Solano County Water Agency. So they pay for my time and for other staff time as well. So again, collectively, the GSAs will pool their funding to help for SGMA compliance and to pay for GSP actions. So here's a look at the annual costs for SGMA compliance for all of the GSAs. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Solano GSA is the largest GSA. We make up 60–70% of the geography of the subbasin. We are actually using 86% of the groundwater. And since this is a groundwater plan and what we have followed with the other GSPs and what's going on in every other county in the state, it makes sense to make this equitable to how much groundwater is being used as to how the actions will be developed throughout the subbasin for each of the GSAs. And so this is kind of a snapshot, our best estimate of what the costs are going to be on an annual basis as of as of when we submitted the GSP to the Department of Water Resources.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you. I apologize having some technical difficulties. So Chris laid the groundwork for the basis for the SGMA compliance costs for all of the GSAs and how everyone is paying their fair share. And now we're going to talk about how the Solano GSA is going to pay and cover its share of the SGMA compliance costs. So if we look at what the revenues are that the Solano GSA needs to comply with SGMA for its GSA, and I just want to reiterate an important item that Chris highlighted, which is for the Solano Subbasin, which is comprised of several GSAs, all the GSAs have to comply with SGMA. If any one of the GSAs is out of compliance, then essentially the subbasin would be out of compliance. So it is important that each GSA and the Solano Subbasin has a funding plan in place to cover their costs. And when the Solano GSA was looking at what its revenue needs were, as Chris mentioned, there's a GSA administrative cost, which is a little over $63,000 a year on average. And then there was the total joint implementation costs for the Solano GSA to cover their share of the GSP implementation and SGMA compliance costs. And that averages about $507,000 a year. So essentially, these are the total annual revenues that the Solano GSA needed to cover in their consideration of a charge or long-term revenue source to comply with SGMA. And going to the next slide, you can see that that has been summarized in the Solano GSA charge report, where the GSA board wanted to be transparent and also thorough in evaluating what are the options for their long-term funding strategy. And the idea was to develop this GSA charge report, which established a 5-year revenue needs projection for their compliance costs with SGMA, as we talked about, and also how the regional costs were allocated, which Chris highlighted that each GSA is going to pay their fair share of. And one important note is that because the Solano GSA chose the Proposition 218 mechanism as its long-term funding strategy, they're only allowed to project or establish rates over a 5-year period. And so this charge report establishes the proposed charges during the 2023 to 27 period. And then in the future, that information and proposed charges would be updated based on the actual cost of compliance. And the Proposition 218 charge is one of the most common forms of long-term funding approach for GSAs throughout California. And I think one reason is, besides that it allows the GSAs to maintain local control, is that it's a very transparent process. There's a public review period. There's a charge report for full disclosure of all the key information and the basis for the proposal. And it provides everyone with the ability to understand the charges before they're considered for board approval. And so the charge report, which is the background information, and the proposed charges that Chris Lee was highlighting, was reviewed and approved at the May 12th, 2022 Solano GSA board meeting. So when we look at the next slide, how does all this fit together? Well, each GSA in the Solano Subbasin needs to have a long-term funding strategy. And in terms of the Solano GSA, because they are the biggest GSA service area and they have the biggest revenue requirements, they're going to use the Prop 218 charge for their SGMA compliance costs, and then pursue grant funds and other funding sources for project implementation to maintain groundwater sustainability. And that is kind of the current long-term funding strategy that they're employing in coordination with the other GSAs. So looking at one question we wanted to cover tonight, because we know that you're probably all wondering, well, when the Solano GSA board developed the charge report and came up with a proposed charge, did they look at other options? And they absolutely did. They looked at many options. There's always the no action, right? What if the Solano GSA just said, we're not going to move forward with any kind of a long-term funding program for SGMA compliance? What would happen in that case? And unfortunately, the state would intervene and impose their policy and fees and charges they've already established for GSAs that are out of compliance with SGMA. And we'll kind of show you what that looks like, but that's not a very attractive option. Besides the fact that the fees are higher, you would lose local control, but that was an option considered. There was a charge per acre approach considered, which turned out to be the recommended charge approach, which is based on the available factual data and information at the time the charge has been developed. They also looked at short-term charges for the first couple of years of GSP implementation. The problem with that is it doesn't get them through the first 5-year implementation period, so they'd have to come back and adopt charges in years 3 through 5 And so that would be problematic as well. And then they also looked at some other more nuanced options, such as perhaps user classes or charging based on other factors. But the problem is there was not enough factual information at the parcel level, which is the basis for the charge, to have a definitive and defensible, other charge approach. It is something the board's going to consider in the future, and they're looking to collect additional data so they can consider other options in the future. But they did look at a suite of options, and so we want everyone to know that. And if we look at our next slide, the result was looking at the 5-year revenue projections, which is captured here on this slide as the operational budget. That was the sum of the Solano GSA admin costs plus their GSP implementation costs that are shared on a regional scale. The revenue requirements for Sigma compliance for the Solano GSA is about close to $571,000 per year over the initial 5-year period. And that resulted in a proposed charge of $279 per acre, I think, as Chris Lee mentioned. I guess one note we just want everyone to realize is, based on our evaluation of the GSA charges throughout California, this is the third cheapest charge. It doesn't make it any easier for those subject to the charge, but clearly the Solano GSA was looking to keep the charge as low as possible. So what if the state did intervene? Because this is another common question. Why do we have to comply with Sigma? Well, as we mentioned before, the state is very well equipped to come in and impose themselves on GSAs that don't comply. So we just thought we'd pick out, what if you had a 40-acre parcel with a single well? What would your state imposed charge be versus if you were charged the proposed $279 per acre? So this simple table shows you that for this 40-acre parcel, under the proposed Solano GSA charges, you would have an annual fee of about $112 per year versus the state imposed charge if you had a 40-acre irrigated parcel and you were irrigating at a rate of 3 acre-foot per acre per year on average. Your annual fee would be over $5,000 per year. So clearly, that's not a good deal for anyone, maybe except for the state, right? Because they would be collecting additional revenue. And so you can see it's a very negative impact on those subject to the charge in the Solano Subbasin if they were subject to the state charges. And I don't think that serves anyone well, but we just wanted to show you an example. And this really exemplifies what happens across all parcel sizes, but it's definitely preferred to pursue the proposed charges versus the state imposed financial impacts. So I'm going to turn it back to Chris. I apologize for the technical difficulties, and he's going to talk about where we go next.
Sorry, thank you, Jacques. I was typing in an answer here. Let's see, let me get out of there.
And,
okay.
Yeah, and Chris, before you go there, I just want to encourage folks, we're getting some fantastic questions. I really encourage folks, there are some answered questions, and I encourage you before you type in a new question to look at those answered questions that you see. We can come back to any of them, but I also just want to remind folks in a minute, we're going to come to a panel where we're going to ask the questions. So if you note that your question has already been asked, please hold on typing it in so that we can get to as many of these as possible. Thanks, Chris.
Sure, thank you. And I kind of want to jump in with some of the questions that I've seen so far and kind of try to weave it into this slide here. So this decision was not come at lightly. The Solano GSA board has struggled with the question of how we find the funding for Sigma compliance and maintaining local control so that, as Jacques mentioned, the state water board doesn't come in and charge 50 to 100 times more than what we're contemplating, and potentially asking everyone to put meters on their wells, or even ask or telling you how much groundwater you can charge. So it's not obviously a small decision. It's not something the Solano GSA board wanted to do. It's just the path forward that makes the most sense right now to maintain local control. So up until just recently, the Solano GSA board had several meetings where we discussed the alternatives. The charge report was brought to them, and a presentation by Jacques and his team on why this made the most sense at this time based off of the data that we have right now. And the Solano GSA board has already directed staff to start gathering the parcel level data. We just haven't had the need to collect that type of data in the past. So that's why we're doing a flat charge at this point. But we have certainly been directed by the Solano GSA board to look at a graduated charge, to look at all the different types of water users in the subbasin to see if there's some other way that we can come about this that makes more sense for as many people in the subbasin as possible. So where we're headed next is that we have a public hearing at the July 14th Solano GSA board meeting. And this is where we're going to have the public hearing on the charge. The meeting does start at 5 p.m. It might take us 10, 15 minutes to get to that item, but this is where we will give a brief overview of why we're doing the charge, open it up for public comments, and then move through the public meeting. If we're successful in moving forward with that Proposition 218 charge, then we will pass that information on to the Solano County Assessor's Office. If we're not successful, we have some real challenges ahead of us. We're not sure at this point, if we're not successful, how we'll come up with that funding. The agencies that make up the Solano GSA board, they don't have that funding available at their level. So it's a real possibility that the State Water Board could come in and take over. And that's something that none of us want to see because we don't want to have an impact on our agriculture community, which we think it might very well have. So that's, again, in a nutshell, why we're trying to get this funding in place to meet all the compliance that is required from the state to maintain that local control. And so let's see, maybe I'll pass it back. Let's see, go to the, yeah, I'm gonna pass it back to you at this point, Jen.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so most of it, I can tell a lot of people have seen this question answer button. So thank you. We are going to move to question and answer. And we're gonna go to a panel in a minute. I just want to make sure that everybody knows how to use the question answer function. You will see any answers that are typed in, you will see them. And I am going to invite all the panelists. Judy, if you can just go to the next slide. I'm going to invite all the panelists to share their screens so that we can put the pictures up, so we can stop sharing the slides now. But Judy, I can tell I'm about to ask you to come back to a few of them based on some of the questions that were asked. Let's go ahead and share folks' photos, and you can see us live and we can see your questions. Really appreciate them. I want to, before I jump into some questions, I want to just do one more reminder. As Chris said earlier, this is not the public hearing. Chris just showed a slide about the July 14th public hearing. This is a meeting where we want to talk about your questions on the proposed charge, the reasons for the proposed charges. And there are also a bunch of questions that have come in, about groundwater and, sustainability for groundwater. So I'm going to jump to some of these, and I also invite the panelists. I'm going to read out some of the questions, but you guys, panelists, have also been looking at those, and I invite you to group any others that you see, and there will be a bunch of questions that we will answer live. So I'm going to jump right into a question from Jasmine. And Jasmine, I appreciate, said, I hope that your presentation will discuss why the state fees would be higher or worse for ranchers who don't actually use much groundwater. And so I know that was mentioned a little bit by you, Jacques, but maybe if you could come back and explain a little bit more about what happens if local control is lost.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We gave you the example of a 40-acre parcel with sort of average ag irrigation in the Solano Subbasin, for several different crops. But obviously, no matter how you cut it, the state charge is still going to be higher, because even if you're a rancher and you have even one well on your property, you're going to be paying a minimum of $300, and then of course it'll depend on your situation, but that is a challenge all over the state in GSAs where you have low using ag parcels. They in almost every case are still going to pay under the state fees a higher amount than the proposed charges that we're seeing in Prop 2 and 8. Now, I will say that the Solano charge is very low. It's the third lowest in the state of the documented Prop 2 and 8 charges that are either in place or proposed. And so, fortunately, in most cases, I think most ranchers in the Solano Subbasin would have a net lower annual charge under the proposed charge versus under the state imposed fees.
I'd like to add a little bit to that, Jen. So another aspect that we still don't know what could potentially happen. Unfortunately, even though we were required to just submit our first annual plan and submit the GSP to DWR in January, they have 2 years to actually review the GSP. If the state water board comes in, they may actually decide that our plan is not what they like, and they may have to develop their own GSP, and those costs would also be borne on all the stakeholders within the subbasin as well. So there's a lot of unknowns if the state water board comes in, and again, we're trying to do our best to avoid what potentially could happen.
Great. And Chris, that ties into one other question that was asked, and Vicki, I think you might have answered it in the comments, but there was a question about if DWR has reviewed the plan. And so maybe you could just repeat that answer, because as Chris pointed out, there's a bunch of things that the state is doing right now. So.
Right. So by the law, the department has up to 2 years from the due date for the GSPs to be submitted for the department to provide back comments or decision on the GSP and whether or not the department would approve it. They took that nearly that amount of time for the critically overdrafted basins. So it's not expected that the department's review will be fast, on the more recently submitted GSPs. So it is an unknown. There are still a lot of things that are uncertain about what the department's expectations are for the GSPs.
Thanks, Vicki. Yeah. So I'm going to go, there's a few different questions. I'm going to try and cover. Herb and Kathy and Charles have all asked, is inflation shown? One of them asked, since inflation is a factor in the fees, what is it? And has it been addressed? And then another specific question was, are cost estimates adjusted for inflation? So maybe one of you can speak to inflation and how that's factored in.
I can. We did propose a 3% average annual inflation rate into the proposed charges, even though inflationary pressures are obviously moving above recent averages. The goal of the GSA is to keep the charge as low as possible. So they selected a moderate inflation factor with that in mind.
Great. Yeah. So thanks. And thanks for those of you who asked questions on inflation. All right. So there's a question about, is this a creation of a new agency that we will have to fund indefinitely? And so I think it's, if one of you wants to just describe a little bit about the GSAs and the history of the GSAs. I know we had a slide showing 2017 to 2042. We could pull that back up if it's useful, but yeah, I want to make sure if we can answer the question about, is this a creation of a new agency that we'll have to fund indefinitely?
I'll take the first shot at that, Jen. So for the Solano GSA, it is a new agency. So this agency was formed in June of 2017. Initially, what we had tried to do is work with all of the potential agencies that could be GSAs and look to see if we could form a single GSA for the entire subbasin. It didn't quite work out that way. And as you saw on the slide, what we ended up with were the 5 major GSAs. 4 of those, well, actually 3 of those were existing entities. 2 new ones were formed, the Northern Delta GSA and the Solano GSA, which I am staff to. And as of now, the GSP and Sigma is going to be around for the foreseeable future. We have to plan out for 50 years. We have to show the state within 20 years that we are managing our subbasin in a sustainable manner. So for at least the next 50 years, we are going to have to fund this effort, but you know, who knows what happens beyond that point.
Yeah, and related to that, Chris, there was a question here from Thomas about after 5 years, does the tax go away? And yeah, so maybe you just spoke to that a little bit, but maybe if you can go on to just address that question.
Sure. No, unfortunately, it will not. We are going to be looking at funding mechanisms every 5 years, or maybe even sooner, as I answered one of the questions. And as I mentioned earlier, the Solano GSA has directed staff to look at a graduated charge. So we realize that there are many different types of water users in the subbasin. And so they want staff to look at some type of charge that makes sense for all of those users, and not this flat charge, which unfortunately, you know, our hand has kind of been forced with the little amount of time the state has given us to respond and make sure that we're maintaining not only compliance with Sigma, but also maintaining local control. But absolutely, we're going to be looking in the future to a different charge that makes more sense for more stakeholders, if not all stakeholders. And so we'll be doing that as we're starting to gather data now. This current one will run 5 years, but we hope to get something that may take its place, you know, in 2 years from now, that may be makes more sense for more stakeholders within subbasin. But moving forward from them, yes, we will be doing some type of funding charge every 5 years.
Great, and I think given that, it probably makes sense. There's a couple questions in here on grants, and so I might turn to some questions so that the panel can describe the grants that have already been pursued. There's 2 questions in here related to grants. So Judy, if you wouldn't mind just sharing an example of the grants that are being pursued, I'm going to ask you to show that on a screen so that folks can describe that what other funding is being sought. And then I am going to come back. Kathy had a series of questions where she posed some ideas, so I'll read those in a minute. But first, maybe let's just look at the grants so that there's an opportunity to talk about the fact that the subbasin has been looking to grants and other funding opportunities. Yeah. Judy, would you like me to share that slide, or while Judy's pulling it up, maybe Chris or Vicky, if you want to mention somebody, one commenter, I'm looking for the question right now, but somebody said, is it brand new that looking for grant funding? And I thought it would be important to point out that the GSAs have already been applying for grant funding and will continue to apply for grant funding. So Vicky or Chris, would one of you want to speak to that?
Sure. Well, why don't you start, Vicky, and I'll take over, or I can start. It doesn't matter. So essentially, we did apply for and were successful in getting both a Proposition 1 and Proposition 68 grant to develop the groundwater sustainability plan. And the local agencies have actually matched that $1 million grant with like funding. In fact, we've actually found more local funding. We've had some additional funding provided by the Solano County Water Agency, which actually is not part of the GSA. They provided an additional $700,000. So the local match is actually almost double what the grant funding is to date. And as you mentioned, there will be future grants. There's going to be a cycle coming up this fall. It's mostly going to be geared towards projects and management actions, which Again, we're very fortunate with our groundwater. It's quite stable here with our subbasin because we have, pretty good surface water supplies out of Lake Berryessa and a little water every now and then from the State Water Project. But we're in pretty good shape as far as our subbasin and groundwater levels. So we're not going to need to do any projects or management actions right off the bat. But as I mentioned earlier, we do want to work with some landowners that are willing to maybe do some pilot projects to see, can we get some of those funding streams come into the subbasin? And then as we move forward, there's going to be opportunities for other local or state or probably federal and private foundation grants that we might be more successful in. Unfortunately or fortunately, because we're in good shape, we're a medium priority subbasin. There are a lot of other areas in the state that are in pretty bad shape for groundwater and for just water in general. And those high priority and critically overdrafted basins are probably going to get a few more points on their grant applications, and the state is going to be providing them probably more funding up first to take care of some of those critical water needs. But we are certainly going to be looking to funding where we can get it to helpfully offset some of these costs in the future.
One other thing to maybe add on to what Chris explained, there's also services that the department has provided to help support the development of the groundwater sustainability plans, and also going forward the implementation of the sustainability plans. So the collaborative has tried to take advantage of those, including the facilitation support services, to have ag innovations, helping with the outreach and all of that, community engagement. And then also the department provided monitoring well installation services for some areas where we're looking to fill data gaps and gain more information. So these are all things that the department wants to see, and it makes it more likely that the management stays local.
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. So I think, you were just speaking to a bunch of questions that asked about other ways to fund this, particularly state grants. I'm going to read out, there's a series of questions where people have put forward a lot of other ideas. And so I'm just going to read out some of those other ideas for funding and invite you to talk about what options the GSA does and doesn't have. So one person notes that for 2 years schools were closed, could use some of our unused school taxes. Somebody asked, can we consider asking the SQA board for more funding to offset the property owner fees? Similarly, Kathy asked, why are property owner fees not included? It asks, what other options for funding did the Board of Supervisors, I'm assuming that must be referring to a city Board of Supervisors, bring forward? What can we appropriate funds from the county services and have local governments try to raise revenue without the Prop 218 approach? So there's a series of questions in there. I realize that there's a lot, but I think it's important. People want to know, people have creative ideas, and so I think it's worth explaining one more time what approaches were considered and why this one was selected.
Sure, I'll take the first shot at that, Jen, and there was a lot there. Let me answer some of the easy ones first. So generally when there's some type of charge or tax or levy, it has to go to what that is actually going to contribute towards. So where we have existing general funds or things of that nature that a city or county has gotten through contributions, it has to go for the services they provide. We're talking about something that's a new service, meeting the compliance points of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And that's why we're doing this Proposition 218 charge, to make sure that we are meeting the requirements of just what is needed for Sigma and just for the GSP. And so we can't go and look and take money from some of those other already formed sources. So that's part of the issue. I'll try to get the other one. So the Solano County Board of Supervisors, you are correct. All 5 of them do sit on the Solano County Water Agency Board of Directors, as do all 7 mayors and 3 irrigation district board members from the irrigation districts we sell water to. one of the issues with the water agency taking on more of a role here is that we have to realize that the Solano Subbasin is only a part of Solano County. It's not the entire Solano County. So we're talking the eastern portion of Solano County. So we have a bunch of other entities, several supervisors that represent other districts that are not actually even in the subbasin. So, you know, we've looked at that early on. We've had those discussions years ago, and since the water agency is not part of the GSA per se and is not using groundwater, the contributions that the water agency has already contributed, which is quite significant actually, is probably going to be the limit at this time. We can certainly take that information back to the Solano County Water Agency Board of Directors, but that is a policy level decision and not for something for staff to contemplate.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so there's also another series of questions where folks are asking, noting that Proposition 218 has different ways to approach charges, and I'll just summarize it with Susan's question, which says, if charge for use meters on wells seems most fair. So maybe you could comment on that and what kind of charges those would look like.
That actually is a fairly common technique that's being used in a lot of other subbasins in the state for various reasons. The most common reason why it's being used in other subbasins is because they have limited amounts of groundwater. They have to be quite restrictive on how much groundwater is being used. Again, we're very fortunate that we actually have groundwater leaving our subbasin. We have a positive amount of groundwater generally on an average annual basis. Not every year, we have different amounts depending on, you know, the environment, what's going on. We're obviously in the midst of another severe drought right now, but in general, our subbasin is in good shape. We've also looked at not asking people to put meters on their wells. It's expensive, and we wanted to try again to cut costs as much as we could for all of the stakeholders that would be affected. We know that a flat charge is not the best fit for everyone, but we did look at do we want to put meters on each well, and it seemed like that was not a good solution at this point. It's just a lot of expenses for each individual landowner, and we're hoping to stay away from that in the future if possible.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to turn, and Judy, I'm going to ask you to probably share the screen again. So there are a couple questions in here where people are asking about, you know, they're saying, I really want to see more about why the state would charge more. So I'm going to ask Judy, maybe if you want to put that slide, and Jacques, I know you can probably see some of these questions, but there are a few questions in here about the cost comparison between the state, where that came from, and what the state might charge for a property that has no groundwater wells.
Yes, that's always a good question. You know, this when we look at the comparison we provided for this meeting, and also it was a scenario that we looked at when we did the charge report for a water using parcel, if you will, that's subject to the fee. But to answer your question, the state fees are based on charges per well plus water use for the parcel involved. And so, you know, the minimum charge is $40 per acre foot, and it goes up to $55 per acre foot. We try to be conservative in this comparison and use the lower per acre foot charge. But there would be, I think, a minimum administration fee of, I still think it would be, and I apologize, I would want to double check this, but it's not going to be free. In other words, if you have a large parcel with no well, you're still going to pay a fee under the state program, which I believe is what they call an admin fee, which is going to be at least $300. That's my recollection. But I do want to remind everyone that the fee is for Sigma compliance. It doesn't matter what type of land use you have, and it doesn't matter what your water sources are or aren't. And so I think that's important to recognize when you look at the charges. So if you're in the Solano GSA service area and you're subject to the charge, really what your charge is paying for is Sigma compliance for your parcel, as well as all the other parcels that are subject to the fee. The only parcels that are exempt from the fee under current Sigma legislation are federal and state-owned parcels and tribal-owned lands, but everything else is subject to the charge. So hopefully that helps answer some of the questions people have about the local charge versus the state imposed charges.
Yeah, and Jacques, as long as you bring up that point, somebody was asking why are federal and tribes excluded from the charge? Do you just want to answer that one while you're there?
I think a great way to answer that is that was a topic that was worked out by the attorneys of the world, and that was deemed as the policy direction that all the GSAs have followed since they've been pursuing Sigma compliance under the Sigma legislation. So it was decided by the state and attorneys that that was the way it was going to be for different ways that GSAs might fund their long-term funding strategy.
Thanks. Great. And I just want to thank, I want to just highlight to folks, there's some great questions coming in about, like Carol's question, as a property owner, how can I contribute to recharge in the subbasin? Just want to highlight for everybody here, I am prioritizing a lot of the charges questions right now, but that doesn't mean we're not answering, you know, a lot of questions that good questions that people have about groundwater sustainability. So I encourage everybody to look at the answered questions so that you can see we are working to type in answers so we can answer as many questions as possible. And I want to just highlight another question. Somebody asked, are you going to be developing an FAQ about fees on the website? So want to say that's already been developed, and Lupe, I might invite you to include the website link on solanogsp.com to both frequently asked questions page, which talks about charges, and also a fact sheet on the charges. So please, if you don't mind, Lupe, put that in so that the questioner about that knows that it's already there. I also want to just bring up, Margaret brings up a point that as a residential well owner, you're not going to get a meter on my well. I don't think anybody has suggested that that's the goal. I think rather the earlier point was to answer why the metered approach wasn't considered and proposed. So just want to clarify that for Margaret. I will continue making sure that questions get aired, but I also want to invite any of the other panelists who have seen some questions that they know are top of mind for a lot of folks. I invite people to jump in with any of those, and I'll keep going through the questions. There's a question from Melissa. Just want to understand the charge to owners who have ranch property, but a water well is only for personal use, not for ranch irrigation. If you can just, it seems like the question here is, you know, would they still pay?
A well is a well. If, you know, under the state program, if there's a well serving the property, you would pay the well fee. And then you would pay based on also water use at the property.
Great, that answered a couple of questions there. Kelly is asking, what do we get for these charges? So want to just honor that some people on the call might not have followed the Sigma process. So if one of you just wants to describe the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, I know we mentioned that, but if again, you know, these are charges that are funding the sustainable groundwater work in the subbasin. So Nick or Vicky, do you want to speak to that?
Those fees are largely for compliance related elements. So there's as you know, as a condition of the groundwater sustainability plan and the requirement of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there's considerable monitoring and reporting that have to occur. So those include annual reports, monitoring of wells, stream conditions, land subsidence, water quality conditions across the subbasin, and reporting that on a regular basis, and then every 5 years conducting essentially another update to the groundwater sustainability plan. So those are the a lot of the key elements that are supported with the with these fees. But certainly they were also detailed. Other elements were also detailed out in some of those tables that were presented earlier.
Thanks.
I just want to follow up on Nick's comments, which are really good. A key requirement of Sigma compliance is GSA coordination, and so you wouldn't want to do that at the parcel level because that would be a heavy lift and burden. And so the GSA is handling that responsibility for you. Not only GSA coordination within the service area, but between the GSA. So during the GSP implementation period, there is a GSA coordination requirement. And if you don't meet the minimum standards DWR has set, then you would be out of compliance. So I just wanted to highlight that's another key benefit that you get as someone who's paying the charge.
But we are going to be both sharing this recording and sharing a log of the questions that were asked and the answers that were typed in. So just want to make sure that people are aware of that. We will be sharing the answers to the questions that were typed in. A couple questions that have come in that are new questions. There is someone who is requesting a walkthrough of the $4,800 slide. So if Judy, I know you were just pulling up a slide to show the answer to the question that Nick was just answering. Would you be able to show that again? And Jacques, I know you walked through it, but perhaps somebody joined late. The question most recently on that is, I am still not really understanding where the $4,800 use fee for the example came from. Was that calculated from the $40 per acre foot figure?
The answer is yes. The answer is, for the example we provided you with, we just picked a 40-acre parcel that's only served by one well. And so under the state imposed charges, there's a per well charge, and then there's a consumption charge based on use per acre. So we assume on average 3 acre foot per acre per year of use on top of the single well charge over the 40 acres as the basis for an example comparison. And obviously, as Chris Lee mentioned, we have so many different types of users, it kind of runs the gamut, but the way it sort of pans out is for almost every scenario, and you know how it is with everything, you can find a few exceptions, but the majority of folks would be paying more under the state imposed fees versus the charge that's being proposed. But we can certainly provide more information on that and more examples if people want.
Then there's a question from Joseph. Thanks, Judy, for sharing that. If we go back to the panel, if Joseph says, I own a second 5-acre parcel with no well, will I be billed for it?
Once we collect the parcel level data, we will be able to differentiate between the different water users. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get some type of charge. As Jacques said, everyone is benefiting from the plan, even though none of us want this. The state's mandating that we have to pay for the compliance points, have to pay for the GSP activities and actions that are making sure that we are compliant with Sigma. And so everyone in the subbasin is going to be paying some type of charge. But if you have a parcel that is not using groundwater now, it may be a lesser charge in the future. And that's what we're going to try to look at, is see if there's some type of way we can do a graduated charge that makes a more sense for everyone in the entire subbasin, instead of just a flat charge, which, again, given the unfortunate time constraints that we have before us, this is what makes the most sense moving forward now. But staff have definitely been given the task of moving forward to collect the data at the parcel level, so we can definitely look at some type of graduated charge in the near future.
Thanks, Chris. So there are a couple questions here. I'm going to read the one by Brian. There's a couple related ones. How is the cost distributed between the different GSAs? It seems the Solano GSA is bearing a larger cost per acre than other GSAs. So if you wouldn't mind answering that question, along with, there's a related question about the delta. So maybe if you can speak to, again, this meeting is focused on Solano GSA, but I think there are a couple of questions here. So if you could speak to that.
Sure. So the simple answer is actually it's pretty close between the Solano GSA and, say, Solano Irrigation District, which does have surface water. Say the city of Vacaville, even though the parcels are smaller, they're getting charged a lot more for their water rates. So what we tried to do, and again, I know this is not what anyone wants, but we've tried to look at it from a groundwater perspective. What was being used in each of the GSAs, and this is a model that's being used in every other subbasin in the state. So it made sense for us to take a similar look. And so we looked at, through our GSP efforts and our modeling efforts, to see how much groundwater is being used in each of the GSAs, and looked at how much would be charged for each of the GSAs. And it's actually fairly similar. So the Solano GSA, actually, because we have more acreage, we're able to spread that cost out a little bit more. I think, Jock, do we have an example in the charge report that shows a table? I guess we don't. No, we probably don't, because we are only talking about the Solano GSA in the engineer's charge report. But looking at it as a whole, each of the other GSAs is contributing, and it's at a similar level, if not actually higher, than what the Solano GSA is going to be asking for at a per acre charge. And with the noted exception of SID, which is probably going to figure out maybe like 10 cents less an acre than what we're contemplating with our Prop 218 charge. And for the Northern Delta folks, they actually have, again, an existing funding mechanism in place, which I think is actually more than what we're charging right now. There's
one question here, which I think is a little bit off of topic, but it's not on the charges, but I think it is an important one, and it was actually covered in the last meeting. And that is, if we're replacing an existing ag well, will those be permitted by the county? And so recognizing that this is a different question, but one that has been in the queue, I wanted to bring that up.
Sure, and it's a very important question, and you're right, Jen. We did talk about this at the last meeting, but obviously not everyone was at that last meeting. So the governor had an executive order come out at the end of March, and in that executive order, there were a couple conditions that had some implications on well permitting within each of the counties of the state. And so there are provisions in there that Solano County, through their environmental health division, through their well permitting program, they have to do an additional look at applications that come in for well permits to make sure they are in compliance with that executive order, which essentially for Solano County has staff looking at to make sure that any new well coming in does not impact a neighbor's well. And the GSA actually also has to take a look and say that any new well coming in does not impact the groundwater sustainability plan or our ability to move forward with the plan, or it doesn't impact any of our sustainability indicators. And so the Solano GSA board actually approved emergency provisions, and we've actually had, I think, 5 or 6 of those applications already approved from the GSA's perspective to replace existing ag wells that failed. And I know Solano County permitted those wells after the GSA sent in our compliance certification. what we are planning to do at the same meeting, the July 14th meeting, is staff is drafting up a policy for the GSA board to consider for new wells. Again, it'd be a very similar process. We think that it should be fairly straightforward, so that if ag users want to put in new wells, the GSA still has to look at those to see if they are going to impact our ability to manage the groundwater sustainability plan. And Solano County also has to take a look at if those new wells will impact neighboring wells. But we think that we'll have a fairly simple policy in place, assuming the GSA board does want to move forward with that. And they're very connected to the ag lands. Many of them are growers and ranchers and are going through the same issues that many of you are as today. So they are very sympathetic to these types of issues, and we'll be taking a look at a policy at their next meeting.
Great, and thanks, Judy, for showing this slide. Again, this was a governor's executive order, not something originated at the Solano GSA, but thanks for Chris for describing how the Solano GSA. And I want to reiterate, there was a question from Margaret about is this the hearing? I just want to reiterate, this is not the public hearing, and we'll show that in a minute. So Chris, I'll invite you to, again, just come back to work that the GSA is doing to look for other funding sources and the Solano GSA Collaborative.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Jen. And I did see several questions about that. So and just briefly, and I think I answered this in some of the typed in questions, but the Solano GSA, on behalf of the other GSAs, did received 2 grants from the state, a Proposition 1 grant and a Proposition 68 grant, and those were solely to develop the groundwater sustainability plan. And then there was another question about local agencies, their contributions. That was the match. So the GSP was a very complex document, and it was almost $2.5 million to put this thing together, and the grant funding and all of the local match went towards the development of the GSP. That being said, there's going to be, as I mentioned earlier, another round of funding available coming this fall. Again, we're in a kind of a catch-22 situation where we're in a medium priority subbasin. We're in fairly good shape. There are other subbasins in the state that are critically overdrafted that are going to get higher priority for these grants. And most of these grants coming out in the fall are going to be for projects and management actions, which, again, very fortunately, we are not required to do at this point. But as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be looking to willing landowners that would like to potentially do some pilot projects. So we are certainly going to go after some of these grants. And then, as also mentioned, we're also going to be looking at other types of funding, whether it be federal funding or private foundations that can help us potentially offset some of the funding that is required for these GSP implementation actions. Maybe we can move to the next slide. So as Jen mentioned, we want you guys to stay connected. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that. Meetings such as this, future meetings, has been mentioned several times. We have a website for the Solano GSP that has the charge report on it, has information on to see which GSA you're actually in. You can, again, an interactive map. We put press releases on there from time to time. You'll get information on new meetings that are coming up. And there's also information there for each of the individual GSAs and their board meetings. And maybe, Jen, I'll turn it back to you to continue this conversation on how folks can stay involved.
Yeah, I'm going to do that, and also just answer a few questions that came in. So if we can go to the next slide, I just want to, Gordon asked, how do we find the resolution and details regarding the resolution? I believe Gordon is probably referring to the Prop 218 notice. So Lupe, I'm going to ask you to again type that in to the chat so that we have that for folks. Lupe has also typed in a few other links. And so I just want to take a moment. The engineer's charge report, Gordon, if that is part of your question, want to note that that's on the website and solanogsp.com. And then I also want to just take a minute to point out, and thanks to anyone who has been calling in Spanish, we are doing simultaneous translation. There is a website in Spanish. And one other important note, people had asked, what does some of this fund? And Nick described some earlier. I also wanted to, if we go to the next slide, make sure that everybody's aware on the next slide. If you go to solanogsp.com, Solano-Subbasin, this is a map that has been produced so that folks can, a few folks were asking, why is this city not in this GSA? Wanted to make sure that everybody knows you can not only go in and type an address and locate who the Groundwater Sustainability Agency is for that parcel, but you can also see the contact information, etc. So really appreciate the work by the team to put together this and the other outreach. And then finally, we want to invite you to provide feedback via a survey on this meeting. So Lupe just put in the feedback form in English and in Spanish. We appreciate your feedback. It asks you what GSA you are in, so you could have a chance to use this map straight away. We also want to acknowledge that tonight's meeting really focused on Solano GSA for a reason. We knew that many of you had questions about charges, and I just want to acknowledge, especially for those of you who it was your first meeting, which is almost half of the room, please do go back and listen to the great presentation at the May 3rd virtual town hall. I know a number of questions that people asked about the sustainability of the basin were answered in that meeting, and we really encourage you to stay engaged, give us feedback on this meeting, and take advantage of these different opportunities to stay engaged, including, again, tonight was not a public hearing. The public hearing is on July 14th. So I want to just honor all of you spending time this evening. Does anybody from the team have anything you want to add? Anything I missed? Want to thank Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate again, no one wants to do these charges. The Solano GSA board has, had many meetings contemplating what made the most sense moving forward to make sure that we were meeting the compliance points for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. It's very important, I think, for the Solano GSA board and in general for all stakeholders to make sure that we have local control, that we don't have the state coming in and telling landowners what to do on their property and how much groundwater they can use. And it's unfortunate that we have to do some type of charge, but this is what we need to do at this point to make sure that we are meeting those compliant points. And as has been said, the Solano GSA board has also asked staff to look at additional ways to find funding in the future, and we are certainly going to do a hard look at that, as well. As we know and we've heard tonight, there are many different types of water users, many types of groundwater users in the subbasin, and we want to try to make it fit for everyone as best we can moving forward.
So thank you, and thanks, Chris, for your time in answering the questions. Thank you, Jacques, Nick, Vicky, Lupe, and Judy, and for the translation team, and most importantly for all of you for staying engaged in this conversation.